can you be in the studio? Don't you know there's a virus, there's a COVID out there?
That's exactly what I'm covering. Look.
Oh, coronavirus pandemic. Ooh. I need some of you in my life, but call me when you're done.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Good luck.
Coronavirus.
COVID. It's so much nicer. The COVID. Chat later. How
Bye.
long are you asking?
Like an hour.
You look like a tattoo dude.
Ah, you know what?
Getting old. What can we do? He's sure a handsome one.
Bye.
Bye.
But you put water in your glasses.
It looks like they already put them down. Oh gosh, people, you had me running in my wardrobe and the things that I'm not doing. I realize. That enough?
In your pocket. Can you pour water? See the people here. Okay. If the thing comes,
I think you might have earpiece.
yeah, apparently.
Take out the water.
Yeah, I'll do it now. Just want to put my phone on.
I cannot touch it.
I just want to put it on flight mode.
Sir, can you put water in the glasses, please?
Then the bottle.
The bottle is not fly.
Even mine.
The thing is open already. If the thing come, you just plug it in.
Okay.
Take it. Don't touch anything. You just plug it in.
Don't forget my earphones.
Thanks, brother.
Straight.
This side now. Oh, where is this pants?
Here's the check. Which one?
This one. Vanessa, ook nog een script daar voor mij. Yes. Yes. It's fine, I'll fix it. Nee, hierdie nie, daai net wat daar lê. Selma Moses, you have a pen. You need a pen, Arichon. Make it, you have a pen for me there, please.
Who wants it now? In South Africa?
Huh? The emergence of COVID-19 has thus far affected almost every sphere of life, including the economy. Good evening and welcome to this live update of the COVID-19 situation here in Namibia. I am Patrick Sam and Salma Moses is our sign language interpreter. Now, following the recent ban on all exit and entry of goods, of people into the country, as well as the lockdown of the Erongo and Khomas regions, various players in the economy have had to adapt or relax regulations. Here with an assessment on the impact of COVID-19 on the finance and banking sectors, I'm joined by Rodney Ngwaib, who is an economist, as well as by Ms. Charity Muya, the CEO of the NCCI. Good evening and welcome to this special program.
Good evening, and thank you for having us tonight.
Okay. Obviously, later, before we engage the panel, we'll later be joined by Mr. Romeo Nel, the Director of Banking Supervision, to tell us what are the changing regulatory frameworks that have been imposed on the financial sector. We'll obviously be joining with you. You'll be joining us via Skype for that interview. But Charity, maybe let's start with you, obviously, being almost a custodian of the private sector. It seems like the globe, not just the continent, and Namibia has been taken on by a tremendous clash where it's looking at what do we prioritize and why do we prioritize the things that we choose to prioritize. And it seems like on the one hand, it's the people, it's the planet, it's the ideas around prosperity, very, very macroeconomic kind of ambitions. And at this side, we have microeconomic players that are feeling the pinch. What's the situation?
Yeah, I think, Patrick, for a start, we probably have to say that this pandemic is a global tragedy. So governments really are, in a situation where they all have to, find measures and ways of really making sure that they can still keep their economies going. And it's not different in the case of Namibia. Yes, it will be very worrying now for the financial sector because remember, in the case of Namibia, or probably even any other economies, they were faced already prior with almost 3 or 4 years of consecutive recession. Now with this disease, actually, that is this virus that is now all over, obviously there's a huge impact on their clients who will actually have a problem to make sure that they also commit to their financial obligations. So yes, there are those that would want to make sure that definitely they also put together stimulus plans in order to ensure that they can still be able to provide the facilities to their clients, but also not risking, the collapse of that sector. So it's really a situation that all players have to make sure that we come to the table and see how we can actually resolve it.
But Rodney, in all honesty, the response or the resilience of an economy has to be made up of the various components of it. So is our economy resilient enough for such a global pandemic?
Speaking about resilience, usually a cycle takes about a few years to overcome. So I don't think anybody would have a magic formula for just an overnight recovery. But however, I've realized, I think last week, too much of the debate when I was watching about the British economy was too much about self-employment. One of the aspects in Namibia that we don't really put up front is how do we define self-employed people? How do we find people that are driven by business income that is quite, that is from time to time, and it's not monthly income. And usually our system is crafted around monthly income, daily income, and annual income, which is not actually the case. Some income is exponential, and some income basically is spontaneous. So in this case, if we go back to the drawing board and define self-employed category of people, you will realize that most of the people in this country, even in the SME sector, are actually self-employed people. So if we don't have an adaptive formula in, in dealing with them, growing them, and ensuring about their institutional existence, then in times like this, we have to make very strong reflections about which sectors we're looking at, and then we will be responsive in terms of being adaptive.
Okay. We're obviously particularly tonight looking at the financial sector, and Mr. Romeo Nel, the Director of Banking Supervision, is now on Skype joining us in this conversation. Good evening, Mr. Nel.
Good evening to you.
Hi. Thank you very much for making time out to join us on this special broadcast here from the NBC. Just to start off with, what are the policy and regulatory changes and why did the Bank of Namibia deem it necessary in the context, obviously, of COVID-19?
Yes, thank you very much. There are a number of policy considerations that we've looked at during this distressing times. The first one was to agree with the Bankers Association to consider a loan repayment moratorium during this time. Now, the loan moratorium or the repayment holiday really is to allow the payment of interest to be postponed. And we've looked at a period between 6 months to 24 months within which this should be considered. But of course, one will also have to give attention to what are the underlying financial condition of the borrowers during those particular times. Just maybe give you a perspective that some of the views that are out there is that the repayment holiday should go for a much wider populace, but the banks need to apply their credit policies in line with what we are proposing, because we also cannot compromise on the risk that banks will have to take, which could actually then compromise also the stability of the financial system.
So who does this apply to, and what are some of the prerequisites thereof?
These policies will apply to borrowers in a general sense, but borrowers that are particularly affected by this global pandemic. And the banks would still have to apply their policies accordingly. So we've just provided banks then scope in terms of their policies to apply their credit policies still to the various sectors and then see what alleviation they can give under the current circumstances.
Okay, so how do borrowers really navigate in these extraordinary times? Who becomes the priority almost in this context in terms of ensuring the survival of not just the sector, but obviously of the economy itself?
Well, it's a difficult question to say who should take priority. For us as regulators, we have a responsibility to ensure the stability of the financial system, because without a financial system, there's also no economic development. And therefore, for us, first and foremost, as regulators, we have to make sure that the stability is maintained in that sector. But we would also acknowledge that banks are a catalyst to help economic growth and the spurring the economy to go forward. And therefore, we would want to give banks also then the tools and the means to help kickstart an economy that almost came to a standstill.
Okay. But how do we ensure almost not the misuse of such policies and regulatory changes to get away with unfair implementation in this context of ensuring that, that it becomes a win-win in such difficult times?
When we considered and when we've agreed with the Bankers Association on these policies, the key point that we've agreed on is that there must be no customer worse off principle that needs to be applied. So we also want them to apply these policies in a fair and transparent manner. Further, we've also then indicated that our policy, our regulatory mechanisms or our regulatory supervisory tools would still apply as normal. Although we've provided them with this temporary relief in that regard. So we will continue monitoring the situation on the ground and how they apply these policies. When people are going to approach them and feel unfairly treated or feel aggrieved in terms of how they apply their policies, there are still guidelines for consumer protection that can be followed. by approaching the consumer desk at banks, as well as approaching the managing directors or CEOs' offices. And if they fail in that regard, then they can approach the consumer protection desk at the Bank of Namibia, and then we can be the intermediary with the banking sector to see how we can resolve those type of challenges.
Also, Mr. Nel, some of the realities is that we can't possibly foresee the actual implication or the extent to which the damage can take place. So can we look at these relaxation of certain regulations as once off, or would it be an ongoing thing? And what systems are in place to ensure that there's almost like a feedback loop that's going between the various stakeholders and the central bank in ensuring that this is not that it's still relevant as the time passes?
Of course, we cannot say at this particular juncture whether this is a once-off application of some of the relief that we've granted. We are still monitoring the situation, and we can also maybe not use all the levers all at once, and then later on sit with nothing to activate. So what we've done is we've activated a number of levers to help kickstart and at least allow banks then to have available capital to inject into the economy, into those sectors that have become so vulnerable. But we are monitoring the situation and would then see what other levers we can still utilize to further assist banks in that regard.
So just to obviously conclude the interview, what is the overall impact that you foresee in terms of the relief measures having on the potential financial impact?
Well, if you just look at the liquidity relief measures that we've introduced now, looking at a buffer that sits above the minimum liquid asset requirement, there's a buffer of almost about 5.3%, and that buffer, if banks use that liquid asset buffer and approach the central bank, they can look at roughly about 6.7 billion in liquidity that they can draw on from the likes of a central bank at the current repo rates that's prevailing. So those are some of the calculations that we've done on our side to see how far some of these relief measures go and how far the liquidity or cash flows that we can make available to banks can assist them.
As a concluding question, given obviously, in the past context, some other sectors have been already affected by the economy beyond just, the COVID implications, the kind of pre-existing conditions of the economy. Now, looking at the financial sector specifically and acknowledging that they've done pretty decently compared to the other sectors, are we willing to give them more of a pinch in this time to ensure a greater enabling environment for the other subsectors in the economy?
Well, that's probably not our place to make such a decision. The banks will have to make such a decision, taking into consideration the risk also that comes with such decisions, because we as regulators would again go back to them and saying, okay, when you've made these decisions, what are the underlying factors that you've taken into consideration, and therefore it makes it a bit challenging. We are in uncharted waters. We are in unprecedented times and require interventions from all of us, and everybody will have to play their part, I believe, in this, and banks in particular as well. But banks have made a promise that they will make their contribution, and we will have to keep them to that.
Any concluding remarks?
Yes, I think these are, as I've said, these are unprecedented times. We all have to pull together to see our country through these distressing times. And I think the banks are one of the tools that can assist us, but that's not the only tool. So, and I think from a national perspective, there are many other interventions that are already underway, and if all of these things come together, we are surely we are sure to actually get our country through these difficult times.
Okay. Mr. Nel, thank you very much for that meaningful contribution to tonight's panel as well. Some initial thoughts?
Yeah, I think you see, from the NCCI side, what I would want to say is that, already last year, we had started the conversation with the Bank of Namibia and the Bankers Association in terms of really lobbying for the Bank of Namibia to review its regulation regarding the determination of loan provisions and the suspension of interest. That's a bit too. And that conversation already started last year, and when COVID now actually happened, obviously you could see that the same sentiment was, put across by other sectors to ensure that that could actually be considered. And I think it's quite an applaudable move from the Bank of Namibia. We have already seen that some of the financial commercial banks have already started to initiate that. Already yesterday, I believe, Standard Bank made its own announcements in terms of the relief measures they're putting in place. My biggest worry is really with our SME sector, because these are the biggest part of our business, in this country.
But Charity, even in that context, given the urgency of the implications of COVID, some banks were announcing immediately, some banks are saying end of the month. Does that show a lack of...
When is end of the month? Is end of the month March or April?
But these are these kind of things. So even if the provision is there, is the regulation strict enough to understand the urgency of the SMEs and those people that will still be paying, the prior repo rate compared to the converted one?
Yeah. I'm very careful about paying attention to what happens in the social media. I prefer that, let the banks, because we had a meeting already last week, and the bankers were represented there.
Address the urgency. That's my question.
It does. I think there is a need to actually address the urgency. Obviously, you're right. Why I'm saying that is because I'm informed that there are certain SMEs where some of the banks have already started doing that even before, some banks actually does that announcement. Of course, there's so much impatience because many of our SMEs are saying, look, they want to hear a formal announcement. What is actually happening? The committee that is actually, mobilizing all of these conversations around, somebody wants to say, okay, this is what the banks are doing. This is what these other stakeholders are also doing. And you have to have a form of stimulus package that everybody wants to actually hear. And it has to be done as in yesterday already.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rodney, responses?
Based on the bank's strategies, basically, it will facilitate that there's liquidity for the banking sector, the commercial sector, and then the financial markets. Yes, but how about, from the onset, most of businesses basically have been surviving on their own. They haven't been businesses that really relied on banking loans and so on. So basically, if you are touching on that segment of facilitating for longer loan repayments, and I also know that they have been mooting some type of bond repurchasing from the bank as well. So the central bank can come in terms of some quantitative easing. But if those happens, basically it just carries on the weight for the more formal sector. What about the more informal sector?
But that's an interesting question as well, but particularly because here, even if you didn't need banks' financial support, that was because you had the necessary demand.
Yeah.
You had and you're selling it, but now the movement is confined. People's association to certain products is limited, is constricted. So people who didn't traditionally need banking and financial support might also be now in a position to need that. How do we deal with that?
I think the bank has to make it flexible, to give flexible loans to sectors and services that they have not reached out in the beginning. So they should knock on the doors of sectors which are affected. Your tourism sectors. There are many micro tourism operators that are out there, and they've been doing significant good business. They've been banking with the banks, and they probably even have a good financial status. So the banks are basically looking at categorizing, these are our clients, these are not our clients, and then they push most of the clients maybe to DBN or those development state banks. But commercial banks should also look at it and say, what is more reachable for them? Who can they meet in their immediate areas where they are, and at least help 10 to 20 businesses? They can set a certain limit.
Sam, I actually agree with what you're saying. Look, I was actually just looking now, especially in one of the sectors that, is actually critical at this stage, and these are the taxes. At the moment, they're being told that, you can't now have you can only be limited to a certain number of people that you have to actually drive. And that's where the majority of our people who are in the formal sectors, actually,
Yeah.
that's what they use.
Exactly.
Now, it would mean for a taxi driver that it's almost 70% of their income actually cut down. So I think when things actually get to normal, you would want to actually make sure that how do you reach to that sector as well, just to make sure that they're also back on their feet. So the expansion in terms of the sectors, definitely, I think that's one thing that we probably want to lobby more, that they actually, get as much as possible. It's quite a number of them, those that are also in the cleaning services.
Yeah.
It was just something that you would do immediately. It comes, I can be able to make income now.
Yeah.
But now with these limitations, obviously there would be a serious, cash flow issue in all the sectors as well.
Can I add that?
But also in terms of the movement of goods and services, we also know, we were talking yesterday with some of the the employers federations, and one of the biggest concerns was turnaround times for goods and how that could affect things like pricing. We've seen it with sanitizers. The demand goes up, the price goes up. So how do we manage also the slow turnaround time of goods and its effect on living standards or the price of living?
Look, we are dealing with this issue daily now. As I'm speaking, I was dealing with a number of issues because there are truckers that have already been, had to be quarantined somewhere, and these are actually carrying essential goods. Now, if they can't actually make sure that they deliver to their markets, then it means there won't be enough on the shelves, and obviously it's impacting a lot of the consumers and the market actually there.
Okay.
So it's an issue.
Let's quickly get Rob Parker, who's on Skype as well, who's a consumer lobbyist as well, joining us into this conversation. Good evening, Rob.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for making time out to join us for this very important conversation. I don't know if you've been watching, but let's just start with in terms of from a consumer perspective. Charity was just about to get into that. What are the immediate and kind of urgent issues regarding the implication financially of COVID-19?
The immediate implication for consumers is that they're not going to be able to keep up with their bills, with their necessary expenses, rent, basic utilities, food, water. I mean, just the basics. People are losing work. People are losing contracts. You talked about all the people who are self-employed. Their clients are going away, and somebody needs to factor in some heavy duty institutional relief for consumers, or they're just not going to be able to keep up with their bills.
Okay, so Charity, in terms of the kind of effect that you're talking about, how do you link these two from not just like a production-based society, but also a consumer-based society? How do we fill that need?
Look, when just to get back to what I was actually trying to conclude there, we have issues with border issues first, the turnaround, because there's congestion there. Then when these truckers or that are supposed to deliver, when they get inside the country again, there are also internal challenges with roadblocks, and then the quarantining of already yesterday I was dealing with issues whereby these truckers were actually carrying, frozen food. And then you quarantine this person and this driver, and then this driver is quarantined and put in a bed and breakfast. You have not tested this person yet. There are also risks involved in there. Now, you are delaying the time, because now to get to the consumers now, they cannot actually get the things on the shelves. Already there was a case of ShopRite now where honey, they will need to stock honey. It's an important commodity. For 2 days now, it's now all of a sudden there all these issues that you want permits, all of a sudden you need this kind of permit to actually get that on board. So those issues, we need to attend to them with urgency, because at the end of the day, even with the consumers, we are going to have a serious problem with this social distancing. They will not actually, because people will be hungry, they want to eat, they want to get to the stores. I want to just get there 5 minutes, 15 minutes, get my stuff and get back home. But if that doesn't happen, when you now have to get it on the shelves, everybody doesn't have anything. So now that you have an influx of people, now the crowd has to rush to make sure that they get those commodities that they could not get within the space of time that they could have actually gotten them.
But
So-
it seems to be fair that these things work simultaneously.
Yeah.
You have to get the border posts ready. You have to get them sanitized. You have to, get the immigration officials trained
And
prepared.
then now,
And
because you've got the essential services, now there is need to have the certification of those companies that are classified as essential critical. Our line Ministry of Trade, obviously, they have been dealing with a huge backlog because now they have to change their business processes now. You have the limitation in terms of the people that can actually be in a particular space. Then you are introducing this measure to adapt and just change that to make sure that you can have that process fast-tracked and as efficient as possible. It becomes a challenge. So it's a lesson on its own.
Yeah.
I think it's really teaching us to be more innovative, but there is need to really exercise expensive emergency right now.
let me quickly get back to Rob, and then I'll get to you, Rodney. But Rob, but now it's just not an issue, particularly around getting consumers, affordability and access to the market. But it's also what will be on the market for consumers to purchase, and how does that then affect, choices? How does it affect consumer choices?
Consumer choices are going to be constrained by the products on offer, and we fully support the efforts made to free up processes to make sure, as Charity said, that the food gets to the shelf and gets to the supermarkets, and does so in a way that isn't bottlenecked. I'm more concerned with the consumer's ability to be able to lock down for months and be able to have the funds to even go to the store to make those purchases. I think there needs to be some sort of universal basic income or something set up, because a lot of the businesses are small businesses, and if consumers don't have spending power, then a lot of small businesses are also going to face that wrath from the bottom.
Okay. Rodney, as the economist, does the school of thought in which how we have designed our economy support some of the initiatives that are being proposed, like a universal basic income grant, and is that really the response to the gaps that are in the sector?
It does to an effect, but the only thing is, Namibia has been warned times and times again that our economic scope should be the basics, the primary setting of our economic foundation. It should be shifting away from a net food importing country to be a food production country. And when this happens, even about essential services and about foreign dependency becomes of a lesser effect when you look at such crisis situations. If we open up more land resources, if we open up more loans towards agricultural services, agricultural innovation and technology, then we make sure that we are basically covering up too much, say maybe about 50% or 70%. Say we should make a threshold to say more than 50% of Namibia's food shouldn't be imported. Then we are moving towards a good trajectory to say that whether we like it or not, that we have to stick to what we can produce, and we have to stick to what we can, because the more we get used to a certain level of productivity, the more our markets become responsive towards Namibian local products.
Okay, let's keep it there. I think this conversation is very insightful. Namibia, please stay with us as we bring you this live COVID update, and particularly we're looking at how the spread is affecting the financial sector and its implication on the greater economy. When we come back, the panelists will be here with us and we'll be taking callers. So please do dial the number that will be appearing on your screen. I'll give you a hint right now. I think it's 061-291-3339. That is 061-291-3339. Please do call us after this break. It's Tuesday, the 31st of March, 2020. We're coming to you live from the capital city here in Windhoek, and it's your daily COVID-19 update. In the studio, I'm joined obviously by economist Mr. Rodney Hoyb, as well as Ms. Charity Moya. And Rob Parker is obviously on the line to give us the consumer lobbyist perspective as well. I think when we're talking about this response, and the question I really want to get in, and starting with you, Charity, is what is, having identified the gap, what should be the immediate, medium and long-term responses be, so that this resilience that we're talking about, this idea of responsiveness in your economy to whatever situation in terms of adaptability, what should those things be? Identify for those of us.
Well, the immediate response at this moment, what I can actually emphasize, buy local, support local. We've been speaking a lot about growth at home, and in as much as we avow financing to say you want to support startups, how do you support startups if those that have already been in the business, you're not even supporting them? You are not actually creating a market for them. So it's very, very critical at this stage for Namibians. Really, I'm also speaking to those people that advocate, for consumer lobbying, whatever, that we need to have a serious consumer education. At the moment, with this crisis, like in all other crises that we've had before, the first point of call where government comes for support is the private sector. Now, how do you get to the private sector if you do not have a private sector that is almost put to the streets? So we have to be very, very, supportive of local industries. And I have seen even during this crisis, the innovation that's already coming out there. You can see many of them already going out wanting to produce masks. We've had actually industries that are producing the sanitizers already. But how many of them knew about this?
But let's use a sanitizer as an example. You might have had companies that have been producing sanitizers. People know now it's a crisis. Now they might jump onto the ship as well. And so how do you know, in terms of this type of support, whether it's almost like a briefcase situation that you're supporting, or a company that is invested in employment and reaping the seeds? And how do we make that distinction?
There is an association of Namibia cosmetics industry, whatever. Yes, and they have about over 40 manufacturers that are producing those sanitizers, and many of them are actually exporting to the European markets. Their own market is not supporting them. They have tried, when you've tried through the retail charter, let's create shelf space for these local products. We're not doing that. I remember that at one point I had gone to Zambia, ShopRite Zambia, and when I looked at those shelves, almost 40% of the products on those shelves were local products. Where have we gone wrong as a country? We have to be very serious when we get most of these retail shops. There must be a condition to make sure that if you're going to actually set up, we welcome those investors, but make sure at least you create that shelf space for local products. Exactly. And I'm not saying giving those local products and put them at the back where they're not visible. So we need to actually start with that conversation.
Let's hold it. Philip is waiting for us. Good evening, Philip.
Evening, sir. How are you? I've been waiting a bit longer.
Sorry very much. Sorry for that. Please give us your input.
All right. My input is just to look at the policy issue and the repercussions thereof. Look, our country is not a poor state, so to say, economically, but the decisions that are being made on the upper part, the decision makers up there, when it comes to the repercussions and what their policies that they are making up there, on the ordinary person on the street, is where the problem is. Look, this situation has been already been forecasted. Should not even have been this corona issue. But now we are talking about the SMEs being hardly hit by these conditions. Understand? These could have already been forecasted, or a policy should have been already in place to address the current issues that we are facing today. So we are facing it right now. The other one is the decision of the Bank of Namibia. Who does it affect, really? Will it affect the real men on the street, the people who are selling your kapanas, the taxi drivers, those people? Because even the financial institutions, the banks themselves, FNB, the Standard Bank, you name them, they will hardly give a loan to an ordinary man who comes with a good suggestion of saying, I want to go and buy a taxi, I want to go and just buy the first kettle to start a kapana with. They won't finance such a person. But now, to whom are you responding? My question. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
It's a question of risks. I think that's what they were saying. Banks always have to assess risks.
Interesting one. Yes, Philip, we really agree with you. That is why I was saying, we only place institutional recognition for someone who's operating a business we are too much applying too much policy blocking necks, and then we don't realize that actually at the moment, the informal guys, the smaller people that were referred to as the smaller people, are one of the mainstream employers in the economy, because they make sure they have domestic workers, they make sure their kids are going to schools, to private schools, to crash, and so on. If we cut them off at the moment and we don't have any recognition at the government, then trust you me, it's likely that most of them are close to extinction.
But from an economic perspective, Charity, you're talking a little bit, but maybe let's also get to Rob. Rob, since you're not here, we're forgetting about you. Are you still online with us?
Sure I am.
Well, what's your position on the shared sentiment around, obviously, in the inclusion and who has access to financial institutions that's been brought up here?
I think, what this crisis has done is exposed kind of the shortcomings of our financial system, and it's illustrated that the inequality created by our financial system, really leaves, at the end of the day, it leaves everyone vulnerable when a crisis like this comes along. And I sure hope that when relief comes, it is as our colleague says, that there's something geared towards the small businesses who employ so many people, that there's something geared for consumers, and there's some consideration for working people and unemployed people. It would be a real shame if a lot of the relief went to large companies who have assets that they could borrow against, rather than going to small business owners and everyday people.
Okay. We have a caller on the line. Good evening, caller.
Yes, good evening.
Please give us your input.
Yes, I would just like to have a quick question. It's in regards to telecommunication that I heard the minister, I think it's the finance minister, spoke about yesterday. He spoke about the importance of telecommunication, but now we're having an issue with SIM replacements with MTC. Is there any way any way MTC can assist us with even any mobile home here in Commerce region, where we can do SIM replacement, data updates, and all those things? Just a quick one. That's just all I want to find out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is it essentially essential services? And should then they, should we have access to them at certain points?
Look, with the lockdown, majority of the SMEs were forced to actually get their staff to go and operate from home. Now you're talking about an SME that could actually go to clients, maybe 10, 11 clients working within a walking distance. Now you are forced to make sure that now you adapt technology to be able to reach your clients or to be able to operate remotely. I am one of them that I can actually testify that when people were running to MTC and Telecom Namibia to get the modems, they were out of stock. So you have a crisis where the smaller business person is not even able to function remotely. So it's a critical function at this point in time.
Okay. Some of the impacts of such digital shortcomings?
I think, let me just tie this question to what you asked me previously about basic income grant. If we go back a little way in terms of digitizing our economy, the digital economy, we need to look at also enhance adapting social mapping tools in terms of identifying who are the informal settlements, where are they, what job do they do. I know recently we are doing a satellite-driven survey with our National Statistics Agency. But moving from there, how do we go forward? How do we realize areas that need internet? Because this itself is a UN development goal itself. So we really need to push more. I realized also Telecom, when I was advising them, I spoke to them a few days ago, I said, this is the time when you're supposed to push your market, because everybody will be at home and everybody would want to use your services to increase the bandwidth and to introduce fiber lines at home.
Interesting. Another issue, Rob, is the issue of panic buying. And I think from a consumer perspective, it also almost reproduces the inequalities. I was watching some interviews where people were saying, we weren't ready if we didn't get paid before the 31st for the lockdown. And now we don't have access to some of the services that people who did have the money have access to. Rob, what's your position on that?
that's absolutely something that happens, and I think people with privilege, people with the ability to go out and hoard things should think twice before they do that, because while you've got two pantries stuffed with things, somebody else has come and found that the basic goods that they need aren't available, and it is very much a class issue, and consumers who have the ability to go buy things in bulk should be considerate of other people. So far as we know, there is no bottleneck of supply, so there's no reason for consumers to be behaving that way.
Okay. Charity, profiteering?
Sorry, maybe to add to that, even when the announcement was made and you saw a lot of people rushing to all the supermarkets, particularly to get the sanitizers of the markets. If I live in Auckland Park, Pioneers Park, Ludwigsdorf, I probably don't need much sanitizer because I'm in an environment that is very conducive for me. I can use my hot water and my soap to take care of myself. So instead of buying 20 back just to keep for myself, I could actually spare to make sure that the vulnerable one in the informal sector or can actually have access to that. And this is really a time that also calls for humanitarian hearts. Let's not be selfish. This is a pandemic that, the majority of the people that are actually employees of most of these companies, they live in those vulnerable communities. And so when we make those choices, obviously, when we are running around, we have to be very considerate about that. Bulk buying, yes, the panic buying. I think with the lockdown now, when you have actually made sure that you are restricting in terms of the people that are coming, maybe there should also be restrictions in terms of with the quantities of certain goods that you can actually take there, so that at least there is room for everybody as well. I think that's very critical.
The issue of profiteering, should there be price regulation when it comes to certain services in such a context?
Absolutely, because we saw exactly what happened, how prices of goods just shot to almost 100% of the actual pricing. I don't think this is what we want to see now, because at the end of the day, you're doing a disservice, both your communities and the people that need that service. So we had put as part of our proposals, actually, the private sector COVID-19 task team. That was one of the proposals that we put forward, that look, we need to make sure that we also have that control in terms of consumer pricing.
Okay. Sam from Vinto, good evening. Welcome to the program.
Hi, good evening. How are you?
We're well. Please give us your question.
Good. My only insight is that I want to add is that the government must change the whole way how they do things. We must, I don't know whether we have to put a limit on this BEE thing, where we can start producing things from our government, putting factories and those stuff under our government, and to start producing more in Namibia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
That's directly, I think, to you as a more state-controlled economy.
Yeah.
Well, this is what the pandemic is bringing us to, these very existential questions around the school of thought around our economy.
Yes, this basically there's a pressure on the entire SADC community at large. We look at integration across the borders. We usually know that we cannot get all the raw materials from one country, but we have to look at South Africa, for example, was one of the first countries highlighted that they would be affected by the export ban in China and by the industrial shortages in China. What happened since then? They have to surpass that competitiveness from a Chinese product and that of a regionally developed product. Regionally, we are moving towards African continental free trade, and we should do everything we can to sell African products and not Chinese products.
Okay. Concluding remarks. We're running out of time.
Well, I think in conclusion, all I want to say, the first thing is definitely there's a lot of lessons to learn from this whole pandemic. First, making sure that business become more innovative. Secondly, making sure that the consumers themselves, they support local, because we need that. At the end of the day, we are coming to our local business to support them. Thirdly, we really need to emphasize on the issue of growth at home. Let us put in place incentives to support our local business so that they can get back on their feet, and they must be supported. Incentives have to be there. We need to come with a stimulus package as soon as possible.
Okay. Rob?
Hi, thanks. I would like to see some some guarantees for consumers that people aren't going to get evicted from their house during this time because they can't pay their rent. Nobody's internet should be cut off this time while everyone's working from home because they fell behind during their bills. Nobody should be charged interest on their overdraft at this time while they're struggling to stay afloat. And there should be a universal basic income for consumers during this period.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Ronnie, to finalize, your final sentiments?
I'll pick up on Rob's. If all the markets basically, they can extend the maturity period for all the bonds, which basically means they can extend to 21 or 22 months, which means in this immediate moment, there need to be a rent and a housing bond or mortgage holiday. There must be, not need.
Okay. Charity, I'm going to give you a little bit more time because before we call over to the minister to get our daily update, there's going to be a conversation around, private sector involvement, state control. Just the caller saying, should government, own the factories, for instance? I saw that got you a certain way. What's your response to this?
Isn't this the some people that are saying, state-owned companies must be privatized because they have problems with the way they're actually being managed?
Okay.
As a state, you need the tax to be able to actually run the economy, to be able to pay salaries, to take care of your people. So leave business to the business people and let the state actually do what it is there for them to do.
Okay. Convincing schools of thoughts here. Thank you very much. Let's cross over to the Minister for our daily update. That's standing by. Good evening, Honourable Minister.
Good evening, sir.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you very well.
Thank you very much for making time out in obviously your very busy schedule with regards to the spread of COVID-19. Would you like to give us our daily update here on our special broadcast?
Yes, with pleasure. Good morning, viewers. I would like to start by saying that the latest update from the previous one on the front of the testing, there has been 20 samples were tested. The result as follows. One test was inconclusive. 3 tests did not provide a quality result, and they will be repeated. 16 of them test negative. So far, of the batch of 20, there is no positive case identified. On the front of the compliance with the measures of the state of emergency, we have observed few improvement in some area, but in the area of crowd management, there are serious concerns. There are instances where funerals are being conducted in big numbers. People go to church in big numbers. So the observance in terms of mass gathering is not satisfactory. And we would like to call on the public, please, to comply, because failure to comply will lead us in a more serious situation, which will be very difficult for us to manage.
Okay. Just on the issue of testing, those 4, one of them inconclusive and the 3 that need to be repeated, when do we expect the conclusion of those results? Honourable Minister? I think we might have lost him there on the call. Just waiting to get direction. Okay, I think we've lost him there as a result of some technical difficulties. But I think that's the latest update. There have not been any additions to the 11 cases that have been reported on, 16 tested negative. But the big issue here is obviously the issue that has got to do with compliance and what that actually means. The state of emergency, just to clarify for our viewers, is for the entire country. That means obviously the measures that were read obviously from the Office of the President regarding the state of emergency must be followed within the entire country, and no region is exempted. Now there's additional methods that have obviously been proposed within in terms of a lockdown in the Khomas and the Irongo regions, where people are then obviously expected to follow additional criteria or additional regulations rather in this context. And I think that's what's been emphasized. Big issues, I think it's around compliance, as the Minister was saying, particularly with regards to crowd management. So we're asking, obviously, the churches, when he's talking about funerals, you will have a role to play. This is actually very important in terms of ensuring that we are able to contain the spread of the virus, because that in itself, I think, is the intention of all of the efforts that are going out here to make sure that the virus does not spread throughout the country and there is no further implications. Obviously, with that, I'd like to thank my panelists. Thank you very much coming in, having a very difficult conversation in difficult times, but I think it's important to adding to the conversation that's taking place. Rob, thank you very much for using the internet as well to join us here in the studio tonight.
Thank you very much.
I think this is the new normal.
I'm afraid so.
Only maybe there you have it, social distancing and using the internet with regards to that. That's all the time we had from you, from the entire team, myself, Patrick Sam, as well as our sign language interpreter, Ms. Salma Moses, and the entire team. We'll be back tomorrow in Namibia. This is so serious. We want to make sure that you're updated on a daily basis, and we'll be looking at the various facets of the implications with a daily update from the Office of the Ministry of Health and Social Services. Good night.